What's up, guys? Brian Grossman here with Grossman Woodworking and DIY. And on today's video, we're going to be building just a simple box, a keepsake box in this case. But it's pretty crazy to me that I've been doing this woodworking venture now for about 6 months, making videos. And this is the first time that I set aside a little time just to build a box. This is typically one of the first things that a new woodworker will make. It helps you work on several different skills, and it's just, if you can make a box, you can make a whole lot of other things. And so probably should have done this a lot earlier. But anyway, I finally made one. I'm going to walk you through the entire process step by step so you can make your first box. And this one is actually, it's kind of special to me because if you watch the video where I went back to Kentucky and picked up my dad's woodworking tools, I picked up some scrap wood while I was there as well, just some stuff that I found sitting underneath his lathe. And this is actually made from that wood. And I thought it was just some old pine or maybe some cedar. But once I ran it through the planer, it became obvious that it was actually poplar. Has that nice kind of greenish tint to it. But I think this turned out really well. Not sure exactly what I'll use it for yet, but I will put it to use. Just in memory of my dad. But anyway, with that, we'll get started. I'll walk you through the process. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and the little notification bell so you never miss another one of our videos. And with that, let's build us a box.
So I started with the widest of the 4 pieces of wood that I had on hand. And since this one piece was 6 inches wide, I decided to cut a 6 by 10 inch lid from it, which would be the overall dimensions of my box. I'd already planed the wood at this point, and I really wish I'd got some good before footage because they definitely did not look like poplar to me initially. But with the lid cut out, I went over to the table saw to rip the remaining boards down to 3 inches, which is what I decided the depth of my box would be. No real reasoning behind it. I just thought that sounded like a good round number. Then it was back over to the miter saw to cut the sides to length. Now, as I often do, at least once during the build process, I forgot to hit record on the first 3 sides. But I used some scrap wood to dial in that 45-degree miter on my saw to make sure that those angles were good and meeting up at a crisp 90 degrees. And then I cut each end of my sides to length, creeping up on that final length that I needed for each to make sure I didn't leave it long or didn't cut it short. Then it was back over to the table saw to cut a 1/4 inch rabbet for the bottom of the box. And it would help if I wouldn't block the whole camera with my back, but I'm still learning when it comes to videoing these projects, so cut me some slack. But yeah, not the best camera position here. But with the rabbet cuts made on all 4 sides, it was time to assemble the box. For this, I used a trick that I've seen a lot of other woodworkers do, where they simply lay out the sides of the box miter to miter, and then use painter's tape to tape those miter ends together. And you do that to all 4 sides of the box. Put some wood glue in the mitered cuts, and then of course spread out your wood glue with a brush or your finger on the ends of those miters. And then you can simply fold the sides into a box, put some tape on that last corner to hold it all together, and voila, you now have a glued box. Then I wiped off all the glue squeeze out, and I threw a tape measure on it to make sure that it was all square. If you have some corner clamps that'll fit, then you can certainly use them at this point. But I just let the tape do its job and left it there for the glue to dry. And while I was waiting on that, I figured I might as well go ahead and cut out a bottom for the box and go ahead and get that installed just to knock out one more step and to help hold the box square while that glue dried. Unfortunately, I didn't have a big enough piece of poplar left to use, So I actually just used an old piece of cedar fence picket that I had on hand. I just cut it to size and planed it down to the 1/4 inch thickness of the rabbet and then glued it in place. Okay, so what in the world am I doing here? Well, my original lid didn't fit as well as I wanted. I just wasn't happy with it. And since I didn't have a large enough piece of poplar left for a solid lid, I decided to glue one up, just using leftover strips of that poplar that we had from the sides. And once the glue dried on that, I just scraped off the excess and then ran it through the planer a few times to get it good, clean, and flat. With the new lid ready to use, I laid the box on top of it and marked out the exact cuts that I needed to make to ensure that that lid fit nicely on top of the box. Then it was over to the miter saw to make those cuts that I just marked. With the lid cut to size, it still needed just a little bit of work to get it perfectly lined up with all the sides of my box. So I taped the lid across the back of the box and then used my Orbital sander to get a perfect fit on the front and the sides. I then followed that up with some hand sanding with 220 grit sandpaper to get a nice smooth finish. Of course, sanding with the grain. I followed up the sanding with a good wipe down with mineral spirits before getting ready to apply the finish. Not exactly sure why I decided to attach the lid prior to applying the finish, but I did. I don't guess it really hurt anything, but any future boxes I build will get the finish first before applying any hardware. But anyway, I placed the hinges about 1.5 inches from the edges of the box, marked the screw holes, and then pre-drilled those holes to keep from splitting the wood with the screws, especially on that relatively thin lid. With the hinges installed, it was finally time to wrap things up with the finish. And I wanted to keep the natural look of the poplar. So rather than staining it, I went with Danish oil. Following the directions on the can, I would simply wipe on a heavy coat to the entire box. Let it sit for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then I would come back and just lightly wipe off any excess oil. And I ended up doing that 3 times over the course of a couple of days. And with the final coat applied and wiped down, I could finally call my first wooden box finished.
Well, guys, that wraps up our build of our keepsake box. And overall, I'm really happy how it turned out. It's certainly not perfect. My projects never are. And there were some mistakes made and lessons learned along the way. And I like to share those with you because I know a lot of the videos I see, you rarely see that. You know, it's like they just had the perfect build. And that's great if that's the case, but that just doesn't happen for me. There always are some mistakes made along the way, and I like to share those with you so you don't make the same mistakes. You may make your own, you may make some different ones, but hopefully you won't make the same mistakes that I did. So just a few things on this one, really. One, in some of the joints, there's an orangish tint, and I don't know if it'll show up on the camera there, but when you're looking at it closely, you can see. And I assume that is from glue squeeze out that I did not get cleaned up good enough. And then when it dried and then I put the finish on it, it created just a little bit of an orange tint on some of the corners in a few little spots there. Nothing major, but enough to be a little bit annoying because I know it's there. Most people would probably not pay much attention to that whatsoever. But anyway, it was a mistake made. Another one was, I'm not crazy about these hinges. These were the smallest ones they had at Home Depot, but they still felt a little bit big to me when I was putting them on there. And also, just because of the way they're made, they're pulling the lid towards the back just a touch, which is creating a lip here on the front. And that annoys me a little as well. I could probably take some time, or I could have, well, I still can, but I could take some time to sand that lip down and probably eliminate that. But the fact is, it's the hinges causing that. And I think part of it, again, is because they're too big and where the actual hinge, where it pivots. So I may just end up replacing these hinges as the solution. Or I may just leave it as is and call it, it's just one of those little quirky mistakes made along the way. Another thing is I used a piece of cedar in the bottom. This was just from a cedar fence picket that I had. I planed it down to 1/4 of an inch and fit it in the rabbet that I cut in the bottom there. But I used these little pyramids here when I finished it, just to keep it up off the surface here and keep, from getting sawdust and other stuff on it. So I set it on these as I was doing some of the finish work, and evidently just from sitting on there and pressing down when I was applying the finish, it actually put some divots in the cedar. That cedar is a very soft wood. Didn't have any problem when I flipped it over and put it on the lid. I don't see any divots there, but it did divot that cedar. So something to keep in mind if you ever use these little pyramids here when you're finishing your project. I think really that's about it. Oh, I did notice there's a faint little line on the lid here, and again, I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but it looks like I may have had a little bit of snipe on the planer that I didn't take enough time to sand out. You can't feel it, but it's just a faint kind of line across the finish there. But no big deal. Again, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. I was able to put some scrap wood that belonged to my dad to use. I don't really know what else I would have used it for, so a box seemed appropriate, and I'll use it to probably keep some of his other keepsakes in, or maybe put my wallet and keys in, that kind of stuff at the end of the day. I don't know, but I'll definitely put it to use, and it's a great beginner woodworking project. If you haven't taken the time, build you a box. Like I said, there's several lessons you can learn along the way from building one, and if you can build a simple box, there's a whole lot of other things you can build as well. So guys, as always, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and little notification bell. Help me grow this channel to 10,000 subscribers and beyond. And with that, I'll see you guys on the next video.